Are we prepared for a post-antibiotic world? We seem to have survived COVID, but some scientists worry worse is coming via AMRs. Could antimicrobial resistance make antibiotics obsolete? Plus, 8 new cases of the Marburg virus have been detected in Tanzania. Will they stay contained or need the world prepare for an outbreak? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. Last week, Tanzania reported its first ever Marburg virus outbreak. Health authorities detected the virus after 8 people developed symptoms, including fever, vomiting, bleeding, and kidney failure. 5 of those 8 have now died. Tanzania's outbreak comes a month after Equatorial Guinea announced its first case. Since then, the West African country has reported 13 cases and 9 deaths. Although rare, the Marburg virus is not new. It was first identified in 1967 during simultaneous outbreaks in Germany and Yugoslavia, and it's from the same family of viruses as Ebola. It's transmitted to humans through close contact with fruit bats, their food, or prolonged exposure to their caves. And once a human has contracted the virus, it can spread through contact with blood or other bodily fluids. Right now, there is no approved vaccine or specific treatment for Marburg virus. But the World Health Organization says it has 2,000 finished doses of Marburg vaccine ready for trial once the government gives permission.
WHO is leading an effort to evaluate candidate vaccines and therapeutics in the context of the outbreak. The developers are on board, the clinical trial protocols are ready, the experts and donors are ready, once the national government and the researchers give the green light.
So should we be concerned with the Marburg outbreak, and what does it say about what other potential threats might be looming? Well, joining me now to discuss that from Pretoria is Dr. Angelique Coetzee. She's health chairperson of the South African United Business Confederation. Thanks so much for being with us. First, just how concerned are you with this Marburg outbreak in Tanzania? Why isn't it something we should actually be worried about?
Yes, we should be worried about, because on the 16th of March this year, the first cases of Marburg was being recorded in Tanzania. The problem with Marburg virus, it's got a nearly 50% fatality rate. It means 1 out of 2 people will die. The incubation period is very, very short. It can be up from hours to 2 days. Meaning that you can, within 2 days from contracting the disease, you can die. It is really a very, very fast-spreading viral disease, highly contagious. So it is important that we should not underestimate this virus infection. So, and it's also in the western coast. So Tanzania and the western coast is the 2 places where you will find the current outbreak of the Marburg virus.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the symptoms, they sound absolutely horrendous. This is just a horrific disease, even if you survive it. But the fact that it has appeared in West Africa and East Africa, could that actually mean it's maybe more prevalent than we realize? And the good thing that could mean is that there are potentially antibodies already protecting people. Because the science I was reading said that it hasn't actually traveled from East Africa to West Africa. It has been endemic somewhere, and therefore may have been around and evident a lot longer than we realized.
Yeah, if you look at that, at the science and the evidence, yes, you are absolutely correct. And so there might be people with antibodies going around. Still, it doesn't take away the fact that this is a really not a nice disease to get. I've said the incubation period is anything from 0 to 2 days, but it can be up till 21 days, although very seldom 21 days. It's normally a very quick. And it's a hemorrhagic type of disease. So you will not miss it if you have it. You will not miss it because you will start to bleed from your mucous membranes, your eyes, your orifices, and the blood is also highly contagious. That's why you need to wear these protective gear, and track and tracing of these contacts are being done, especially in the one province in Tanzania where it's prevalent. It's been contained for the moment, but it's important to take cognizance of this viral infection out there. Again, as I've said, it's fast spreading, highly contagious, and 1 out of 2 people will die.
And we've heard there are similarities with Ebola here, but, you know, is it a false sense of security for people to think, well, we managed to get Ebola under control, so Marburg couldn't be that much more challenging?
I think that's a false sense of security. You should never, ever underestimate any of these viral infections, especially these hemorrhagic type of infections. It is, you know, you've seen one patient, I haven't had, thank heavens, been able to see one, but I have seen pictures of these patients. One picture is enough, and you know what these people are going through. Should never underestimate this type of infection.
But we are hearing there could be a vaccine on the horizon for Marburg. I mean, is that a good thing, a sense of relief for you, or do you worry that people at this point, and because of what you saw during the COVID pandemic in particular, might be experiencing a bit of kind of vaccine fatigue at this point?
Yes, there's definitely vaccine fatigue at this point. We have seen it in South Africa, you know, especially around measles injections for the children. So we have now a sort of a measles outbreak in Pretoria ourselves because of that. But coming back to Marlborough and the vaccine trials, we need to be careful that not the same thing happens that we have seen with the COVID vaccines, that the countries that really need these vaccines can't actually afford them, or there's not enough equity given to given higher priorities to countries, and especially in Africa, who are in dire need of these type of vaccines.
I want to take a look back quickly with you at the pandemic, assuming, you know, the COVID pandemic is over, and most people do assume it's over. How bad was it in hindsight, especially compared to something like the Spanish flu that killed, you know, 21 million people versus a fraction of that with COVID? And also how the world came together, or didn't come together in some senses, to respond globally to this kind of threat. How are you feeling about how we experienced COVID-19?
So, you know, hindsight is always the best side. But if you look back, and especially during the first and second wave, it was the unknown. You didn't know what to expect. You've never been experienced to something like this before. The symptoms was difficult. But once we started to understand what is happening, and especially at primary health care, we managed to handle it much better. People think it's over. We still see COVID cases. Yesterday, I saw 2 COVID cases in my surgery. But are we afraid? No, and not at that, because we understand what is happening.
Dr. Coetzee, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you really so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated. Well, right now, Marburg is only affecting a small part of the world, and it's a known virus. But the spread of other diseases to new areas could be increasing. A recent report warns antibiotic-resistant superbugs could kill 10 million people a year from 2050, creating a world where simple infections are deadly, and some surgeries are just too risky to perform. Now, some scientists believe we could all be affected by or infected with superbugs in the future. Now, their rise is partly related to climate change. Through global warming, bacteria and other microorganisms grow faster and can spread to new geographical areas. More extreme weather events, such as flooding, can result in sewage or stormwater overflows, often hotspots for the evolution and dissemination of drug-resistant bacteria. Another cause is the misuse and the overuse of antibiotics, which can render medications useless against bacteria. This is known as AMR, or antimicrobial resistance.
So people were using antibiotics, what we would now say is inappropriately. And so then the more you use antibiotics, and you could even say we overuse them at that time, the more you select for resistance.
Well, around the world, doctors are looking for ways to beat superbugs. Last year, the UK approved fecal transplants. They're being used to treat recurrent infections of C. diff. It's a notorious member of the superbug category. C. diff is a bacteria that causes debilitating diarrhea. It's usually treated with broad-spectrum antibiotics, but they can become less effective with each attack. A transplant from a healthy stool donor restores normal function in the gut microbiome, and the immune system can correctly target C. diff and restore gut health. Dr. Bronwyn Morgan leads the CSIRO's Minimizing Antimicrobial Resistance program and says superbugs are already a significant issue for Australians.
We really need to look upstream, and I think Australia has a fantastic opportunity to look at what we can do to prevent and manage antimicrobial resistance. And our report focused in on 4 things, which was sensing and surveillance, point of care diagnostics, to know, do you really need that antibiotic? Because the more we use them, the faster we lose them, as well as vaccines, so building on our investment in vaccines over COVID, and looking at high-risk settings.
Now, we've been warned about the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria for years, but now some scientists are warning of a post-antibiotic world in 2050. Well, joining me now to discuss what we really need to be prepared for are from New York, Dr. Amesh Adalja. He is an infectious disease specialist and senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. From Plymouth, UK, we have Dr. Mathew Upton. He's a professor in medical microbiology at the University of Plymouth and lead for the Antibiotic-Resistant Pathogens Research Group. And from Melbourne, Australia, is Dr. Oliver Jones, a professor of chemistry with the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Thanks all so much for being with us. So, Dr. Upton, I'll start with you. Is using the phrase a post-antibiotic world fair, or is it just alarmist at this point?
I think it's far from alarmist, certainly if you live in certain parts of the world where drug-resistant infections, what we would call pan-resistant infections, so infections that are caused by bacteria that just can't be treated with any antibiotics, that's a reality now in some parts of the world. So saying that we will be in a post-antibiotic era by 2050, I think is certainly not an over-exaggeration or alarmist. We're there already in some parts of the world. It's going to take longer to reach other parts of the world, but I think it's safe to say some places we're there.
So describe what that really means to patients around the world. How different is it from what we're seeing now?
I think we've all mostly become used to taking antibiotics for granted and knowing that when we take them for an infection, they're going to work. And that has allowed us to become quite complacent, perhaps. And it means that many medical procedures that we now take for granted, things like cancer therapy, cesarean sections, orthopedic implantations, hip joints, knee joints, those sorts of things, they're all relatively routine operations now. Take antibiotics away, and many of those procedures become too risky to perform. And so we see in some parts of the world that infections with drug-resistant bacteria is the leading cause of death in oncology patients.
Right.
And so really there's a choice there. Do I get treated for my cancer and risk having an infection that can't be treated, or do I not get treated for the cancer?
Well, difficult choice to make. You've also quoted very quickly a statistic that says AMR could kill more than cancer and diabetes combined. Is that an exaggeration at all? Because that sounds horrific.
Well, that was a prediction that came out of a report from a UK government commission report in 2014 to 2016, and that they estimated that 10 million people a year would be dying of drug-resistant, so AMR-related infections by 2050. And that was an estimate based on current data. But January last year, there was a report in the Lancet Infectious Diseases stating that 1.27 million people were directly killed by drug-resistant infections in 2019. And so if you extrapolate that, really, I think we can see that the estimate of 10 million deaths a year by 2050.
Okay.
Outstripping cancer and diabetes.
Let me turn to Dr. Adalja. Are you any more optimistic about this outlook being described now for this post-antibiotic world.
No, I'm not more optimistic. I think he paints an accurate picture of what a post-antibiotic world would look like. And what it would look like is a pre-penicillin world when routine surgeries carried a risk of infection that was sometimes insurmountable. And I think that what I am optimistic about is that people are talking about it, that you're doing shows on this, that people are now thinking about antibiotic resistance as the public health problem that it is, which then affords solutions from governments, from philanthropies, from private funders, as well as from the pharmaceutical and biotech industries to innovate. And we also have to add to that my own profession of physicians who are the most widely misusers of antibiotics. Antibiotics are used so injudiciously, and this is something that Alexander Fleming, the man who invented penicillin or discovered penicillin, predicted in his Nobel Prize speech that antibiotic resistance was going to become a fact of life, and we may lose this great gift that Fleming and his colleagues discovered for us.
Yeah, I mean, as we said, we've actually known, though, about the overuse of antibiotics for decades. Yet doctors, you say, continue to overprescribe them, even today. Why do they do that?
It's a combination of multiple factors. One is that sometimes patients expect to get an antibiotic. They go and see a doctor, and if they're told, you have a virus, you're going to get better on your own, take some Tylenol, take some ibuprofen, that's not satisfying to a patient, so they may complain or they may go to another doctor. So doctors will sometimes just prescribe it kind of to placate the patient. The other thing is that sometimes doctors are uncertain. They don't know, is this a viral infection that doesn't need an antibiotic, or is this an antibiotic susceptible infection with a bacteria that a person might do better if they get the antibiotic? So they don't know. So one of the solutions to that is putting diagnostic tests, just like those COVID tests that we do, influenza tests, RSV tests, in the hands of frontline doctors so they can actually know what people are sick with and then be armed with that information and say, no, you don't need an antibiotic because you're infected with a rhinovirus. So I think there's two things that have gone on, and both aspects of it need to be tackled. And I think COVID-19 gave us an opportunity to use respiratory viral diagnostic tests more widely to cut down on antibiotics. And the last part of this is we use antibiotics in agriculture as a growth promoter for animals. They get fatter faster, get to market faster. So there is also inappropriate use of antibiotics by the agricultural industry that also leads to resistance.
Let me talk about that as well with Dr. Jones, about the other factors threatening the potency of antibiotics. It's not just what doctors are prescribing and what's used in hospitals or doctors' offices. There's the agricultural industry, for example. Tell us what bothers you most about how antibiotics are abused in a sense.
The issue is we use a huge amount of them, and they get disposed from the veterinary side of things. They tend to get disposed straight into the environment, and then we can get gene transfer from bacteria in the environment to other bacteria, and then those eventually work back to humans. So I agree with the previous speaker. We have an overuse in lots of different areas. It all contributes to the problem.
Okay. I mean, are you, though, as worried as our other two panelists about the almost extinction to come of usable antibiotics on the market?
Well, I'm worried if we do nothing, that would be a serious problem. And I have experience of this. My mother picked up a hospital infection when she had a hip replacement, and it was not treatable. They had to take the hip replacement out. So it's already a problem. We see patients that have infections that just they can't get rid of.
Okay. You know, Dr. Upton, obviously to develop new antibiotics, as well as even new vaccines, you need trials. And there seems to be kind of a growing distrust among those who might be suitable for trials, because in some cases there's been irresponsible behavior of pharmaceutical companies in the past, particularly in developing countries. So how much do you worry about that being an obstacle, actually being able to develop new, reliable antibiotics and even vaccines for that matter?
I think that's a good point about trials in different parts of the world. I mean, clearly we shouldn't be exploiting populations to be able to carry out clinical trials. But what we do need to do is carry out clinical trials in areas where the new drugs are going to be most appropriate, because different populations have different susceptibilities, different reactions to drugs, these sorts of things. So what we need to do is engage more widely with communities with populations where new drugs are going to be developed and used most heavily.
And I mean, it takes a long time, though, as well, to develop and adapt antibiotics and other medications to changing bacteria and changing and mutating viruses. Are we underestimating the time that we would need if we're going to keep up with these changing dynamics?
I think, well, it does take a long time. So from a discovery in my lab, say today, where we find something that looks really quite interesting and want to develop it, it will be maybe 10 years before it's anywhere near the clinic. And that probably isn't going to change. And that reinforces the suggestion that we need to continue these efforts and keep programs of discovery of new antimicrobials and new innovations, either vaccines, new infection prevention innovations. We need to continually keep investing in research and development in these areas, yes.
Okay. Dr. Adalja, to what extent do you think, a certain level of maybe paranoia could actually be good for us? And, at the very least, to stop us from maybe overusing antibiotics and just to be more aware of what's actually possible?
I wouldn't characterize it as paranoia because this is something that actually has a strong basis in reality. As some of the other guests have said, we're living in this world already. We're already seeing glimpses of it. When I take care of patients in the hospital, almost all of them have drug-resistant bacteria. That's what an infectious disease consultant is called in to help manage. So it's really something we're already seeing, making it very, very difficult to treat infections. And I think it is something where people have to take a long-term outlook at this, that part of what's allowed medicine to advance has been the routine use of antibiotics to take care of infections. So that makes cancer chemotherapy safe, that makes organ transplant surgery safe. And if people want to keep that ability to have medicine be able to intervene on these diseases that were death sentences, you have to have a pipeline of antibiotics, and you have to be able to treat these infections as they arise. So people have to start thinking not just about their cough and cold, but thinking about long-term, the human society as in general, about what do we want to do with medicine? What do we want to do with the treatment of infectious disease? And that should galvanize people to understand that these are very precious resources that have been squandered. And if we're in this situation of it's called, bad bugs, no drugs. That's a slogan from the Infectious Disease Society of America. If we stay in that situation, we're going to lose some of the advances. And I think it's not paranoia. It's really being realistic about what's happening. And remember, its evolution is of the bacteria is a fact of life. We have to adapt to it. They're not going to adapt to us.
But what about our own antibodies? And as you know, there are those who argue it is our own antibodies, our own immune system that will adapt to these ever-changing bacteria, these mutating viruses. So I don't need medicines. I don't need vaccines. We saw a lot of this during COVID, people insisting that it was our own immunity that was going to develop and prevent this or any disease from developing.
While it's true, one of our most distinctive characteristics is the human immune system, that it has such breadth and ability to respond. But remember, if you look back at the early 20th century, lifespans were much lower than they were now. And what's changed in that time? Yes, there was sanitation, but it was also the development of antibiotics after World War II, and as well as vaccines. So even though we have this immune system that protects a lot of us from a lot of things, it wasn't enough to see lifespans into the high 70s. It's really about augmenting the immune system with antibiotics, with antivirals, with vaccines that have really allowed us to flourish in a way that we hadn't been able to do in any other prior era of our existence on this planet.
Dr. Jones, I mean, being in Australia and seeing how people really have suffered because superbugs have gotten very bad there, what would you like to say to patients, as regards those who believe we don't really have to worry about these things, it's our immune systems that will adapt? I mean, tell us what you've seen and how people have had to suffer because of a kind of lack of care for what we really need to be aware of.
Well, I don't think it's any worse in Australia than it is in the US or the UK or any other part of the world. I've got a similar problem. We've got a similar health system. Antibiotics are restricted here. You need a prescription to get one, but that's obviously it's very easy to get such a prescription. The problem with relying on, say, evolution of our immune system is that it will take a long time, and a lot of people would die while we were doing it, even if it was that effective. if you think back before we had antibiotics, the number of child mortality was incredibly high. Women dying in labor was incredibly high. People dying of what today is you shrug off pretty quickly, or is not considered at risk. Do we really want to go back to a world where a lot of people die and a few people survive? I don't think so.
Dr. Jones, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three, Dr. Adalja and Dr. Upton as well, for joining us. That's unfortunately all the time we have for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you, our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. And do remember, you can follow us on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.